With everything that was going on with Lucasfilm, the ranch, his personal life, George Lucas made a decision about the future of Star Wars. He had already told audiences that there would be a prequel trilogy by labeling the second film Episode 5, and would commit to that by labeling the original Episode 4 upon re-release the following year. He wasn't committed to doing it, of course. He could do whatever he liked. He didn't technically even need to make a third film, although by this time angry villagers would have likely burned down Lucasfilm if he did that. But one thing he didn't need to do was commit to a sequel trilogy. It had been part of the plan, sure, but it wasn't carved in stone, or giant yellow characters against a star background. He had two balls in the air that he needed to either keep juggling or toss away: the fate of the Emperor and the other that Yoda had referred to. The first one was easy. Rather than kill Vader and have the Emperor step in as the main villain for the sequel trilogy, Lucas could just kill the Emperor off in the third film. And if he did decide to make a sequel trilogy after all, well, nothing prevented him from raising up a new villain later on. The next choice wasn't so easy. The other was Luke's twin sister, although deliberately not specified, who would play a major role in the sequel trilogy. There was no problem with revealing her existence in Episode 6 without showing her, so long as she would finally appear in Episode 7 to resolve that plot thread. You couldn't make that earth-shattering revelation and then leave it unresolved. So Lucas was in a bind. He needed to have an identity for the other, but the story already had too many characters in it, and Lucas had told Billy D. Williams that Lando was going to have a bigger role in the third film, and he told Alec Guinness that he was going to get better scenes than he did in Empire, which had disappointed Guinness greatly. 4 main heroes, 3 support cast, 2 master villains, 2 Jedi teachers. There was no room for a long-lost sister in there, too. So Lucas was stuck. He could only do one of 2 things: either stay the course with the sequel trilogy, or make one of the existing characters into the other. So in his early outline of the plot for the third film, Lucas inserted a little note next to a scene with Han and Leia, the word sister, the first sign that he had made his decision. It was actually the only one that he could make. The droids were clearly out for being the other. Chewbacca the Jedi would be met with laughter. And elevating a minor character like Wedge would introduce the same baggage that introducing the sister would. After his behavior in Empire, Lando would be an unlikely candidate for Jedi training. And while Han had undergone a change, the idea of the smart-ass scoundrel becoming a disciplined student of Jedi teachings simply didn't work. It would strip the character of what made him fun. And that was leaving aside the fact that there was no guarantee Harrison Ford would agree to come back for a third film, so you couldn't build it around him either. So Leia was chosen as sister only because she was the only one without a chair when the music stopped. She was the character who least clashed with being in that role, though there would still be some problems. I mean, true, there was the Falcon scene, which, much like the Owen Beru scene in the original, could support this retcon.
Hear me. Leia. Falcon.
But there were problems nevertheless. First, that if she was so strong in the Force, how was it that Vader could be physically restraining Leia and still not sense either their connection or her potential, when he could clearly sense Ben and Luke over great distances? And second, the films had made clear that this was a love triangle. Revealing that 2 legs of that were brother and sister gave that rather unfortunate undertones. When the Star Wars card game was made, this was even called out with a pair of cards called "This is Just Wrong" and "This is Still Wrong." Unlike the brief kiss for luck in the original, the kisses in Empire were far more of the romantic variety, even if one of them was likely done to make Han jealous. And third, the fact that making her his twin sister begins to stretch credulity. Vader being his father is a shocking revelation. Leia being his sister can seem like an unlikely coincidence, a contrivance that diminishes the gravity of Vader's revelation. But despite these problems, Lucas decided that this retcon would eliminate the far greater problem that the other presented. Still, Mark Hamill called Lucas out over this, accusing him of putting it together on the plane. But Lucas insisted not only was it intended, it was always intended. Something that he would say a lot about Star Wars over the years. Dealing with Obi-Wan's story in the original film being different from what we would find out later, Lucas had Obi-Wan defend the lie by saying that it wasn't a lie. It was true from a certain point of view. This was Lucas's own fallback now, why he would say one thing that seemed to be diametrically opposed to the facts. What he was saying could be considered true in those instances from his viewpoint. In this case, Leia was conceived spiritually as a twin of Luke in the formation of the original script, so making her the literal twin and say it was always that way is indeed true from a certain point of view. But it's not actually factually accurate. Among other reasons, the fact that in the original script, Luke was meant to be much older than Leia was. Leia was supposed to only be 16, and her age eventually raised to conform to Luke only because, as twins, they have to be. So this approach leads to problems with determining what is a preferred memory of events and what more accurately reflects reality. There are many instances where Lucas says something completely the opposite of what I have told you, but there is a consistent pattern to it. Again, this is not an accusation that he's lying, but rather that he is remembering things in a way that is true in a sense, even if it's not factually accurate. For instance, Lucas went to Howard Kazanjian and suggested the third film be called Return of the Jedi. Kazanjian commented that it sounded pretty weak, so Lucas changed it to Revenge of the Jedi.
Revenge of the Jedi. Coming next summer to a theater in your galaxy.
And then in the 11th hour, reinforced by fan letters that said a Jedi wouldn't take revenge, changed it back to Return of the Jedi. This is backed up by numerous sources, the two most clinching being, 1, an actual Lucasfilm market research report that specifically polled whether Return or Revenge would be a better film title, and 2, Lucasfilm pressured Paramount to change the title of Star Trek II, The Vengeance of Khan, into something else so it wouldn't be too similar to Revenge of the Jedi. And yet, Lucas himself would publicly say that all references were just an attempt to trick people. It was always going to be Return, and from a certain point of view it was. Lucas had wanted to do that name all along. But as in so many other cases, it differed from all other accounts. Or take the tale that the original script to Star Wars was so big that he had to chop it into thirds and make it into a trilogy. Lucas did indeed reuse elements of the discarded scripts in both the second and third films. The former used the asteroid fight and the floating city. The latter, the battle on the forest moon of primitives overcoming technology. But this was very different than what was implied by Lucas's remarks, that the script was being deliberately divided for later use, especially when, if you'll recall, the first sequel was actually supposed to be what became Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which has more in common with Raiders of the Lost Ark than the other Star Wars sequels. The effects of this subconscious and or deliberate rewriting of history especially comes into effect when you look at the biography of George Lucas that was written by Dale Pollock. Pollock was on hand throughout much of the filming of the third film in order to get an inside perspective on George Lucas. Well, Lucas was very upset at the final result. He felt it was a hatchet job. Yet if you do a search of reviews of the book, the opposite is revealed. If anyone has a complaint about the book, it's that it's so pro-Lucas. If you take a look at Lucasfilm approved works ever since, it almost always has this sense of spin about them. Return of the Jedi would have a lot of wasted money due to pre-production disorganization, as well as lost days of location shooting due to uncooperative weather. Plus, Lucas would call for more and more reshoots during post-production that escalated the budget so that, when all was said and done, Return of the Jedi would need to make $115 million just to break even. I don't bring those things up to say that look at all of the mistakes that they were making, look at all of the bad planning that was involved here, or anything like that. These are perfectly understandable things to have happen, just like what happened on Empire Strikes Back. And yet, it's an entirely different situation. $115 million just to break even. When, you'll remember, $200 million domestically for Empire Strikes Back was a record-setting amount, and more than twice what had Lucas so incensed about Empire Strikes Back, a mere $50 million versus $115 million. But what's the difference? The difference is that Return of the Jedi was down to Lucas himself. He made the decisions, and so, of course, Lucasfilm-approved items all paint things completely differently. Cost overruns on Return of the Jedi are an understandable part of the business. Cost overruns on Empire Strikes Back are a sign of unconscionable mismanagement.
Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view.
The financial issue that was driving Lucasfilm itself up the wall was Skywalker Ranch. From a pure investment standpoint, the entire plan was foolhardy. If they built a normal building in the city for this kind of thing and it didn't pan out, well, they could always sell it. It would retain its value. But what Lucas had in mind was the opposite of an investment. An estimate was made that for every dollar he was spending to build a ranch, he was getting about 15 cents worth of value. But Lucas was firm. The ranch was the only reason all this stuff even existed. Listen, this is my dream, not your dream, he told new Lucasfilm president Robert Grieber. This is my dream. I own the company. And of course he did. And everyone went along with whatever he planned that he had. But the reason for the concern was that, despite the unprecedented success of Empire, Lucasfilm was burning through money during Star Wars 3 pre-production. Lucas wanted to finance the film himself again. But with only $12 million in the coffers, he'd be hard-pressed to make what was budgeted as a $30 million film. And the film would actually cost more than $43 million in the end. And that doesn't even factor in $3 million that was lost due to speculation on the British pound. So outside financing was once again required. It also necessitated more involvement from 20th Century Fox. This was another contentious problem. Fox had been unsatisfied with several aspects of the Empire Strikes Back deal, and were frustrated with complexities around the first film. Fox began contending that if Lucas stopped making Star Wars sequels, that they would have the right to continue making them, and that if they wished, they could do a remake of the original Star Wars. There was also concern about licensing characters in sequel films that had appeared in the original film, and how that played into their whole agreement. It was a first-class mess, and sorting it out was a Herculean task. Well, because this situation is not silly enough already, Fox had just been bought out by Marvin Davis, a 6'4" boisterous oil tycoon who attended these meetings personally. He was the polar opposite of the introvert Lucas, coming into the meeting and declaring, "Georgie!" and picking him up in a big bear hug, making Lucas feel extremely uncomfortable, but helping the negotiations by using a key man clause to allow the studio to eventually part ways with Fox if they ever wanted to. It was in case Marvin Davis would ever actually leave Fox, which of course he did a year after Return of the Jedi was made, and Fox was left in a, well, very bad position. What Fox got for the immediate was moving up the television rights and the VHS release of the original film. And it stated that Fox would retain its copyright on the original film itself, with all the other rights going to Lucasfilm. This is why the recent purchase of the Fox library by Disney would solve a lot of problems. While much more attention was given to the fact that the film rights for some Marvel properties were now being taken back for Marvel itself, this also meant that the rights for all of the Star Wars films were now owned by a single company, meaning you could get episodes 1 to 9 in a single box set without the need for any lawyers to get involved. A deal was ultimately put together regarding Return of the Jedi, aka Revenge of the Jedi, aka Blue Harvest. The last was thought up by Kazanjian, who realized that not only were people willing to dig through their trash trying to get info on Star Wars 3, but that anyone who heard Star Wars immediately raised their prices. By going with Blue Harvest, they could hopefully dodge both those issues. Which was good because, as I said, Star Wars 3's pre-production was running into trouble, partly because no one could even say for sure what the film was going to be about. Marquand was shocked to discover upon returning to London that massive resources were being expended on creating a lava field for the film, based on a setting that had actually been expunged from the story. Perfectly understandable, as I said. Sometimes these things happen. But it just showed how vital it was to have everything together in order to avoid squandering even more of the studio's dwindling cash supply. What Jedi really needed was, well, to have an actual script.